I want to ask this question. Is it true that everything happens for a reason? I hear that response to times of calamity or times of difficulty, that everything happens for a reason. Last week, when Pastor or Vicar Albino was here, he shared with us Genesis 3. Genesis 3 is that fall of Adam and Eve when they failed God and they tried to cover themselves, and then God walked in the garden and came to them and said, "Where are you?" And that all happened after Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1 and 2, where God created this perfect world. Everything was perfect. Can you imagine that? But someone asked the question, if everything is so perfect, why are we living in such an imperfect world? And Genesis 3 answered that question. Everything happens for a reason, and that reason is sin. The things and the travesties and the dangers and the difficulties in COVID-19 is a result of sin. Now, we may not be able to point to a particular sin or a particular time of sin, but we can realize that sin in the world creates havoc, creates chaos, and it creates all kinds of problems and dilemmas that we need to deal with. The problem with the world is that it often deals with sin with more sin. That's what Ephesians is talking about here in chapter 4. That's what Paul is trying to communicate to the Ephesian Christians. He's saying to them that we are all caught up in the ways of sin that we might call the law of survival. It's a self-serving law, a selfish law. It is a law that gathers and hoards for ourselves without any concern about what anyone else may need. That's the sinful direction that can direct us and mislead us. That's why he says thieves should no longer steal, but instead do good to others and work so that they can help others. He calls upon us to be kind and tenderhearted and loving and forgiving as Christ forgave us. It's so tempting when we look at Ephesians chapter 4 to sense that somehow we need to take care of ourselves, as opposed to being aware that there's others who may have need along with us, and even greater needs than we have. Paul is expressing to the Christians at Ephesus that this is no longer to be us. This is not us. So who is us? We are, as he describes to us, the ones who Christ loved, verse 2 of chapter 5, the one who Christ has forgiven, and the one who the Holy Spirit has placed his seal of redemption on, so that we know that we are the redeemed people of God. That's who we are. We are the ones forgiven, cleansed, redeemed of God, and directed and empowered by the Holy Spirit to be his people. You heard the gospel lesson read earlier. The gospel lesson talks about this blind man who was blind from birth. And so when Jesus approached him, the disciples asked him that great theological question of the day: who sinned? His parents or the blind man? They were saying things happen for a reason, and we want to know the reason. In fact, we want to know the exact sin. Can you imagine perceiving that a child in the womb would have sinned in such a way that he would be born blind? And how many parents and families in our world blame themselves for faults and failures and all kinds of events that they have no control over? The theology of that day was that there must be some specific sin that caused this. But what was Jesus' answer to their question? His answer was simply this: He is going to display my works. In other words, when bad things happen to good people, when bad things happen to bad people, the reason those things happen is because of sin in the world. But what God promises us is that He's going to bring about His good, and His good is that He's going to display His works in us. That is us displaying His works. I'd like to share a few of those works with you. Those who called me right when this COVID-19 started taking effect and we had to hunker down, and they wanted to know how they could make phone calls to those who do not have internet and cannot have the privilege of us sharing this time with them. They wanted to know how CDs or DVDs could be made and delivered and mailed so that they could receive them and be a part of the community, this virtual community that when it's all over, we'll all be once together again. Those who called and said, are there specific needs that people have? Does someone need a ride to the grocery store? Or do I need to go to the grocery store or the pharmacy to pick up food or medicines? Is there something we can do to help people out? That is us. That is the people of this community and this church searching out ways to help not only members of this church, but people who are on the fringes of membership. They're even people who are outside of membership. I believe it's what's happening within all the Christian churches in our community, to display the work of Christ in us. Because that's why Christ died. That's why He went to the grave. To take all of our sin and put it there so that we know that we are cleansed and forgiven. And that's why He gives to us the Holy Spirit, and He's in heaven reigning, making sure that the Holy Spirit works in our lives so that we can display His works to the world. I want to share a simple illustration with you. There's a couple by the name of Fred and Anna Parham in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in my early ministry. Fred and Anna were fairly aged. They lived in an assisted living apartment. And in the morning, they made breakfast together. And then after finishing breakfast, Fred would go sit down in his easy chair and Anna would do the dishes. When Anna finished doing the dishes, she would go sit down in the wheelchair, and Fred would get up and push her out the door and take her down a long hallway so that he could get some exercise. Then when they got to the end of the hallway, Anna got out of the wheelchair and Fred got in the wheelchair, and Anna pushed Fred so that she could get exercise as well. They did this every morning, and then every evening when they had their evening meal, they did the same thing. This is the way that they displayed to each other that love of Christ that they had for one another. That's the kind of display that is happening right now. We are not displaying the law of survival, of selfishness and self-serving. We are displaying the law of imitation. As chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children." We are following the law of imitation. May God continue to guide, direct, and grant us the power, the will, and the wealth to serve Him and display His works in our lives. We live by the loving law of imitation. God grant that for Jesus' sake. Amen.